if you want an answer to the first question, which is how do I find the person who's right for me, you actually start by asking the second question, which is what can I bring to the table for someone else? And if you're really good at bringing something to the table for someone else, hey man, people might be lining up to be your partner. And if they're not, then you might think, well, maybe I'm just not bringing the right thing to the table. And that's worth thinking, especially if you're desperate, you're lost and you're alone. It's like, maybe I got this wrong. And I usually sort of top that with the suggestion that even if you did find the person who was perfect for you, and they're that perfect, what makes you think they wouldn't take one look at you and run screaming away? And they likely would if they were that perfect, because, really, are you that much of a catch? And if you think you are, that might be part of the problem. So that's one, right? Intimate relationship. So I would say to you at the crossroads, develop a vision for your relationship.
If you're the most driven person in the room, you're in the wrong room. That's why today, we're tapping into the wisdom of someone who pushes limits like no other, Dr. Jordan Peterson. These are the top 10 most powerful insights that can transform how you think, live, and lead. Let's dive in.
How do you bear the suffering that is at the crux of life without becoming tempted and embittered? That's really, really difficult. Now, someone might point out, go ahead and be bitter, see where that gets you. And if you have any sense, and generally people have at least some, they know that being sick and bitter is worse than just being sick. And that it's worse, but it's very hard temptation to avoid. Sometimes you want to be bitter just out of spite in some sense, because things are so terrible. All you've got left is your willingness to shake your fist, and say, well, really? Is this like this many poisonous snakes? Really? That's like, maybe I could have learned with just one or two, not 100. And so, but we're all stuck with that. And I think we're stuck with it at every level of our life in some sense. Is how do we maintain a high order moral orientation in spite of suffering and malevolence?
Yeah.
We should make much more of an effort to ensure that kids are unbelievably proficient readers. And a lot of that is going to involve early automatization of letter and phoneme and syllable and word recognition. So, because what happens is when you teach a child to read, first of all, you teach them the alphabet and the sounds. And we have an alphabetic language, thank God, because it makes things much simpler. And so you teach them the letters, and then the 2-letter combinations, and then the 3-letter combinations. And then they can sound out syllables, and then they get words. But it isn't until you can read phrases automatically at a glance that you can read for content and pleasure. And so a lot of kids get stuck, especially if they don't come from particularly literate homes where all of this is sort of taught, maybe starting at, 12 months when they're first dragging a book around and becoming familiar with the book as an object, right, before they even learn to read. You got to get kids through that automatization phase, and that requires intense massed practice. And that's not that intrinsically interesting, right? But if you can get them to the point where they can read for content, well, then it starts to become interesting, just as interesting, let's say, as going to a movie or perhaps playing a video game. And so that has to be made an absolute priority. And if the faculties of education were doing their job, they would have produced technology to solve that problem for virtually every child, because it is only a matter of practice. Smarter kids will learn faster, but with enough practice, pretty much everybody is going to get there. So, and then there's the marketing issue. It's like, well, why should you read? Well, do you want to be stupid? You want to be stupid? What happens when you're stupid? You walk into walls because you don't see them. And if someone comes along who's more educated than you, more literate and cannier, you'll lose, man. You'll lose. And you'll lose too because you can't think properly. So you won't aim at the right things, and you won't be informed by the great individuals of the past. And you need that. We're historical creatures. This isn't optional. So part of it has to be marketing, for lack of a better word. It's not really that, it's an explanation. Why be literate? Because it helps you become who you could be. It helps you move out into the world and have your great adventure. And to bring people along. God only knows what you can do if you've got your words lined up properly. And young men would listen to that if someone who knew what they were talking about was telling them that, as you found out.
If you're looking for certainty, the reality of suffering is certain. I mean, what do you accept as evidence above all else? That's a good question. That's a hard question. But I would say pain is up there. It's very difficult not to believe in the reality of your own pain. It's somewhat easier not to believe in the reality of other people's pain. That's not so easy either, you know. But it's, your pain seems to be undeniably real. And so it does beg a question, which is, you know, if pain is undeniably real, is that which overcomes pain even more real? And I think that's, in some sense, that's the idea that lurks behind the idea of the resurrection.
I was watching this movie, King Arthur, by Guy Ritchie, and when the new king, young King Arthur, takes his sword, he has flashbacks to his evil uncle killing his father. And it's so terrible that he can't hold on to the sword. And I thought, well, what's Ritchie doing there? Well, that's the case for all of us, isn't it? Because when we look into the past and we see our evil uncles, it's just a complete bloody catastrophic mess, isn't it? Slavery and genocide and war and oppression and that's on all of us, isn't it? And it's always lurking there in the background. And so is that male power? Well, yes, in some ways. I mean, if you don't give a man a sword, he can't use a sword, right? So not giving him a sword is one way of making sure he's peaceful, but it's not the optimal way. And besides, if you cripple men, they become far more dangerous. They become dangerous in an terrible underground fashion. Of course, the same is exactly true if you cripple women, but we're speaking particularly of boys, because I suppose there's an education crisis among boys and young men. Well, you want to encourage that power because it's actually a tremendous force for good if it's brought under control. And so, but that's a hard thing to get right. And it also requires a lot of trust and work on the part of women because they want to, it's like Beauty and the Beast, right? Because beauty entices that beast who's real, but uncivilized and dangerous. She sort of entices him into becoming fully developed. And that's what a woman has to do when she, you know, has that work project that she marries or has a long-term relationship with.
And this is another thing you can do in your own household. This is so useful, man. If you get good at doing this, your life will get so much better. You can't believe it. Is watch the people around you, and whenever they do anything that you would like to see repeated on a regular basis, tell them exactly what they did in detail, with, you know, be positive about it, obviously, and just indicate that you noticed. And because I saw this when I was grading student essays, you know, and so I taught this seminar for a long time, and I was trying to teach kids how to write. They were in their 4th year of university in the honors psych program. You'd think they'd bloody well already know how to write, but they didn't. And so I'd have them write a 4-page essay on a given topic, and then they had to rewrite that to a 6-page essay, and then they had to rewrite that to an 8-page essay. And the first essay I graded, it was only 5% of their grade, and I told them, I'm going to cut you into ribbons, but it doesn't matter because it's, you know, 5% of your grade, and so they could tolerate that. And generally, by the 3rd essay, they had written the best thing they'd ever written in their life, and they learned so fast it was unbelievable. But one of the things I noticed was that they did a little testing with the first essay. They'd hand in something, it was just like, God, formulaic, boring. They weren't in it at all, you know. There was nothing of the person in there. There was no thought. There was just the kind of psychobabble that they'd learned, especially if they were in faculties of education. And it was dry and dull, and everything about it was wrong. And so those are hard to grade, right? So what's wrong with my essay? Well, the words aren't right. The phrases, they're not so good. They're not organized well into sentences. The sentences aren't sequenced well into paragraphs. The paragraphs don't make a coherent argument, and the entire thing is empty. But other than that, no problem. It was often easier just to rewrite those essays than to grade them. No, so in any case, though, one of the things I did learn was that even in an essay like that, there is usually like 1 sentence or 2 sentences buried on like page 3 that was an actual thought and reasonably clearly stated and somewhat gripping, you know? It was like the person popped out from all the background rubbish and said,
well, what about this? And if you saw that and checked it and said, hey, you hit the mark right there, the next essay would be like 2/3 that. And that was really fun to see. And then maybe by the third essay, maybe it was all like that. And then they were really thrilled. It's like, wow, I wrote this, you know, and the sort of the culmination, well, it was a fourth year seminar, it was the culmination of their career as a psychology undergraduate. So that was great fun. But you can do that in your own household. If the envious part of you isn't jealous of the revelation of the goodness of the person.
Where you think it's important to look. So I'll say that again. You look where you think it's important to look. And that means that, well, a hierarchy of importance is no different than a hierarchy of value. They're the same thing. A hierarchy of priority is the same as a hierarchy of value. And a hierarchy of priority and a hierarchy of value and an ethic are all the same thing, right? Because you're going to look at what you believe to be of cardinal importance. Otherwise you look, well, if you're talking to someone and you look at their feet, that's not going to be going very well, right? First of all, they're not going to be very impressed with you because they actually want you to look at their eyes. And that's because we communicate value with our eyes, and we do that directly. Our eyes have even evolved to do that. Our eyes have whites around the iris so that you can see where people point them, because it's that important to know what people think is important. We see the world through a structure of value. And I think that a huge part of that structure of value is actually derived from the entire set of texts and their interrelationship that have the biblical corpus at their base. And so it seems to me that I think you can make a pretty damn strong case, maybe on scientific grounds, that you can't see the world except through the lens of the Bible. Like literally, you actually can't see it. Now, if it's not the Bible, it might be some other corpus of texts, but it might be. It isn't. And if it was, well, is it going to be a corpus of texts that we share? Because if it isn't, then we can't share our perceptions and our values, and if we can't share those, then we fight. Those are the options, right? We either stabilize our hierarchies of value in some way that we agree upon mutually, or we fight. Or we're unbelievably chaotic and confused, and that'll just produce fighting in any case. And so we have this structure of texts built from the bottom up. It's predicated on the biblical narratives, and the texts exist in relationship to those underlying narratives and derive a fair bit of their meaning from the meaning of the underlying narratives, and vice versa, you know. And so then is it possible that biblical truth is the sort of truth that is the precondition for truth? Right? Because you think, well, it's religious people make the claim, people of the Bible make the claim, the Bible is true. Well, there's all sorts of different kinds of truth. That's an interesting claim, but it's not very elaborated. It's insufficient. And you know, often what happens to Christians when they debate skilled atheists like Richard Dawkins is they treat the Bible like it's a scientific theory, and Dawkins just mops the floor with them because it's actually not a scientific theory compared to scientific theories. And so as soon as you go there, well, it's like a scientific theory. It's like, no, it's not. It's not. And so does that mean it's not true? Well, it means that if the only thing you think is true is a scientific theory, but I don't think that you can practice science except within an ethical framework that's not in itself science. And so it's possible that there is a deeper truth than the scientific truth, which is the ethic that has to be there a priori before you can even begin to do science.
I first started to understand that what we perceive in some real sense isn't exactly material reality. And partly that's because that's actually impossible. And I mean that technically. And that's something we could go into in great depth, because that realization paralyzed a number of fields. It really started to come to the forefront in many fields in the early 1960s, especially in AI. Yeah. When the AI types started to try to make machines that could see the world in some sense like we do and then act in the world. And what they instantly realized was that, there isn't just something there that we see. This is way harder than we ever possibly imagined. In fact, it's so hard that it looks like it might be impossible in some sense. So how the hell do we do it? And like, we still don't have robots that can move around the world like we do.
Sure,
endless generations.
I'm not maybe it's improved. The last time I looked at this great detail, we didn't have robots that could fold laundry very efficiently either. So
yeah, well, a lot of these so-called simple things like seeing, well, it's half your brain. It takes you half your brain to see, and most animals, like we see way better than almost all animals. Eh?
Really?
Eagles, raptors.
Really? Because we have 2 bald eagles in my backyard.
Yeah, they can see. Their eyes are the same size as yours, and they have 2 foveal spots. Eagles, falcons, they're the animals that can see better than us. But other than that, it's us. And it's half our brain. Just to see. Well, so why? Well, you're a physicist. You understand that reality is composed of levels of being, right? From the subatomic up to the cosmic. It's like, well, first of all, how do you specify the proper level of analysis? Well, one of the things that's quite interesting psychologically is that we have short words are generally used to describe things that manifest themselves to us at our level of analysis. Cat. We see a cat. We don't see a species. We don't see cat subparts. We see this cat. Well, why? Well, that's the level that's most biologically relevant to us, given our embodiment. That's an evolutionary answer. And so we see what we see. First of all, what we see a lot of is memory, but we see something that's overlaid on the world. We actually see the overlay. And hopefully it reflects what's underneath, and generally it does, and it's a hell of a shock to us when we make a perceptual error. But and then I started to learn, especially from reading Jeffrey Gray, that we also see the world within a motivated frame. And he was influenced by Norbert Wiener, who was one of the world's first cybernetic scientists, essentially, a great influence on AI. Yeah, and Gray never talked about narrative, but the frame that he described that we see, and in animals as well, basically has a point A and a point B. So we're always moving towards a goal if we're mobile animals. And I thought, oh, well, the description of the movement from point A to point B, that's the simplest unit of meaning. That's a story. And then I learned that a better story is a story about how stories transform. And so those are actually perceptual frames of reference that transform. And then I understood that if you don't have respect for the transformation process above all else, then you can't transform your perceptual frames when necessary, and then you can't adapt to error, and that destroys you. And so that's all part of that.
When you organize your perceptions around a goal, that provides a container for your negative emotions. So if I want to walk across the stage because I think that getting to the other side is preferable to being here, so that's a hierarchy of value, that place is better than this place, then when I observe myself undertaking the actions that will get me to that place, that's comforting and provides security, because it shows that the structure that I'm using to organize my perceptions and to reduce the world to manageability is sufficiently accurate so that I can implement it. And so we seem to inhabit those structures all the time. Whenever we're looking at the world, whenever we're interacting, we specify a goal, and so that's an ethical enterprise, and we organize our emotions within the specification of that goal, and then we produce hierarchies of goals. So, you sit down in front of your computer so you can write a paper, and you write a paper so that you can finish an essay, and you finish an essay so that you can get a grade in a class, and get a grade in a class so that you can graduate with a degree, and you do that so that you can get a job, and you do that so that you can be, a good husband, a good wife, a good citizen, and you do that so you can be a good person. There's a hierarchy of ethic that permeates the entire enterprise, right from the microcosm up to the macrocosm, and I think that's something like the whole landscape of religious value, with the outermost container. So be a good person, let's say, that's the ultimate aim of the religious enterprise. That's something like the imitation of Christ in the most fundamental sense, and all the things that you do within that are a reflection of that, or you're confused and chaotic. And if everyone's doing that at the same time, then you have a society that's integrated and aiming up and capable of telling the truth. Something like that. Does that seem reasonable? And so what's the proposition here? Well, I think when we describe these frameworks of perception, the name we give to the description of a framework of perception is a story. And I think the reason that we like stories so much is because we need to establish frameworks of perception in order to operate in the world and to allow ourselves to be integrated peacefully with other people. And so we're extraordinarily interested in anything that has a narrative basis. And the reason we're interested in that is because we're trying to build within ourselves and collectively the structure that enables us to perceive the world without undue confusion and chaos, and in a manner that provides some value to us and some sustainability. That's the goal overall. And that seems to me to be the goal of the entire religious enterprise. And so, is it possible that, well, I guess that's the claim I thought I'd elaborate out a little bit today, is that the Bible is true in a very strange way. It's true in that it provides the basis for truth itself. And so it's like a meta-truth, right? Without it, there couldn't even be the possibility of truth. And so maybe that's the most true thing. The most true thing isn't some truth per se, it's that which provides the precondition for all judgments of truth. And it seems to me that I can't see any holes in that argument. And I can't see any holes in it from a scientific perspective either, because I think we do know well enough now as scientists that the problem of deriving ethical direction from the collection of facts is an intractable problem. There's too many facts. There's an infinite number of facts. They do not provide an unerring guide for action. They can't. There's too many of them. They have to be prioritized. And as soon as they are prioritized, well, then you're in the ethical domain. And then that begs the question, what's the valid ethical domain? And the postmodern answer is, well, there isn't one. It's all the expression of domination and power. And I think that's nonsense. I don't think that's a tenable solution. I think that we stumbled onto the proper answer in some sense in our religious enterprise, which is that we aim at what's highest, or we don't. We aim at what's highest jointly, or we're divided. We aim at what's highest, and that gives meaning to all the things we do that are subordinate parts of that. We aim at what's highest, and that's what collects us and gives us structure, all of that, singly and jointly. And that's all what we've been trying to communicate all these centuries as we've been trying to communicate the whole religious corpus, generation after generation, and to sort this out and to straighten it out and to try to understand it. And I think that's where we're at now. Responsibility, and face the things that you're trying to avoid, that your life would be richer and better and for you and for everyone around you. And the result of that could have been that thousands of people would come to me and say, I gave that a pretty good shot, and your advice is really awful, and everything is, well, seriously, like, I took on that responsibility, it just bloody crushed me, and I'm way worse off than I was before, and everything's gone to hell around me, and thanks a lot, buddy. And that it's not like that's a completely incomprehensible possibility, but that doesn't seem to be what happens. Is what generally happens is that young people in particular, but not only, come to me and say, look, I've been trying to take on more responsibility and to face the things I've been avoiding, and everything is way better. It's like, okay, well, isn't that something?
Maybe onto something.
Well, then you ask yourself, well, what's the limit of that? Because that's the religious question, fundamentally, is, well, if you took on all the responsibility you could take on, and you faced everything that you needed to face, what would you be like? Who would you be? And how would the world transform around you? And, well, if the partial answer is, well, if I do that a little bit, things get a fair bit better, then the next question might be, well, what if you did that completely? And I don't think that's possible in some sense, right? It's like, perfection is a horizon that always recedes, but it isn't obvious to me what the upper limit of that is. And certainly we do see people, saints, let's say.
What I was going to say. It's a Mother Teresa, it's a Francis of Assisi.
Who kind of push the limit, and miraculous things happen around them, maybe in the literal sense, and if not in the literal sense, close enough, for all intents and purposes. And so that's heartening. I tear myself apart about this in many ways, because I think Perhaps it's possible to take on too much responsibility and to crush yourself as a consequence. Maybe that's a sin of pride. Who knows? It's certainly possible. But my experience so far has been that when you see people bear their suffering nobly, there's nothing in that but good. That's something. And then when you see people take on more responsibility and decide that they're going to aim up and confront their suffering honestly and forthrightly, that their lives get better and the lives of people around them get better too. And so that's very strange as well, because it also means that the pathway to less suffering is through suffering, right? And that would be hopeful if the world was constituted that way. It's like, well, there's suffering. How do you make it worse? Run away. How do you make it better? Confront it. Yeah, but it's suffering. It's like, yeah, but it's there. There it is. It's right there. It's a precondition for existence or something like that. And it's like you have something important to do as well. And you confront it, and that's the pathway to transcending it.